So thank you for joining us. We are very honored to have with us Dr. Walter Matweychuk. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrongly.
Oh, it's great.
Right. So thank you, doctor, for joining us. Doctor is practicing, he's a practicing psychologist for the University of Pennsylvania in the outpatient services. He has, got his formal training with esteemed people such as the Aaron Beck, the founder of Cognitive Behaviour Therapy, and Dr. Albert Ellis, who's the founder of Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy. Uh, his goal is to disseminate the principles of REBT. And I think Doctor has been very kind enough to put up his YouTube videos on his platform, which is rebtdoctor.com. Also, he runs an Instagram channel, which we can view, an Instagram page where he's putting up videos on a daily basis. He also has free Zoom conversations with volunteers who want to address certain issues and sort of guides them and helps them through the REPT platform. So thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. It's been a huge, we are very grateful. India is going through an extremely rough time right now with the second wave hitting us in a very painful way.
I know. I was reading the Wall Street Journal all this week about these the very difficult circumstances there with short supplies and hospitals being overrun. So my heart goes out to the Indian people. It sounds like it's really a very difficult time.
And having said that, I just want to start about, I've been practicing in my practice. The number of patients are increasing. I want to just start talking about, what is emotionality? What does it mean to emotionally regulate yourself in these tough times?
Well, in my view, emotionally regulating yourself means having healthy emotions to the challenges that you're facing. You see, you can't be neutral when you're facing adversity.
Right.
And if people that you love are getting sick, or even if they're healthy, but that they could get sick because they're elderly and young people too, but whoever you love could get sick, right? You can't be neutral. You're going to have a negative feeling. The question is the feeling you're going to have healthy and somehow going to enable you to do what you can to change what you can and protect do whatever you can to protect your loved ones and yourself? Or is your negative emotional reaction, your unhealth, going to be unhealthy or self-defeating? And is that emotion then going to make matters worse? Either you're going to give up and not try to do the things that you could do to help yourself, or maybe you're going to have emotion that's going to reduce your well-being and it's going to make you hard to live with. And so the question becomes not whether you have a neutral emotion, but whether you choose a healthy negative emotion like concern and you regulate your emotional response towards concern or sadness, or whether you allow the circumstances to dictate your feelings and you go directly to despair, rage, panic, all these emotions that are going to really make life harder than it already is hard. It's going to make it harder.
Right.
So to me, regulating your emotion means regulating or directing your emotions so that you have healthy negative emotions that help you change what you can change.
So, doctor, like you said, we are seeing a lot of rage, a lot of panic because we've seen a number of deaths in India increasing on a daily basis. We are seeing a lot of anger towards the political institutions, of underperformance. So, we are seeing these unhealthy emotions. What can a normal person do to sort of regulate on a daily basis?
Well, I think what they have to do, is recognize what they can control and what's beyond their control. So I think the first thing you want to do is say, I can't change the government, right? That's a long-term project.
Right.
But what I can do is change how I react. And what I can change is my attitude towards the things I can't change. So yeah, the government could have done a better job in so many different ways. But what I can do is have a healthy attitude, one that allows me to adapt to the circumstances as they currently exist. And so I would say to step back and ask yourself, what attitude is going to help me cope? Is it going to help me to say, the government has failed me and they absolutely should have handled this thing differently, and there's no point in trying to help myself? Or is it better to say, yes, the government has failed us, but now harping on that isn't going to make a damn bit of difference. What will make a difference is accepting that that exists, and now looking at how I can keep my composure in this challenging situation so that maybe I can protect myself or my family. Or if there's nothing I can do, then to accept what I can't change. So I would say start with yourself and your attitude towards everything that's beyond your control.
But a lot of people have been complaining about getting stuck in their negativity. So when you're talking about shifting the attitude or the mindset, I think they're getting stuck.
How do they do that?
Yeah, how do they do that? Is there an easy way to move towards acceptance of things that we cannot control? Because like you said, we cannot change the government. We cannot change systems so fast.
Well, there isn't an easy way, but there is a way to change and get unstuck, okay? So let me just briefly show you how to unstuck yourself. The way you do that is to first see that there are basically 3 ideas that keep us stuck. One is that I have to do well. I have to do perfectly well. And if you have that attitude, you're going to get stuck when you're not performing well.
Right.
2, you have to treat me the way I want you to treat me. Now, with that rigid attitude, I'm going to get stuck when you don't treat me exactly the way I want you to treat me. And I'm going to get angry, and I'm going to get rageful, and I'm going to focus in on only the bad parts of you. And then the third way I'm going to get stuck, and this probably is the most direct and relevant to the pandemic, response to a pandemic and the government's failure to, do what would be good or better, is to say that life absolutely has to be a certain way. Other people, the government has to be, proactive, well organized, for the people. They have to be that way. So that's going to get you stuck, because sometimes people aren't going to be as they have to be, and life isn't going to be as it must be. And so people will get stuck in an ideal version of events. And the way to get unstuck is to see that our rigid attitudes really don't match reality.
Yep.
What matches reality better, and then getting unstuck, is to question those attitudes and say, the first thing is does it help me to think in this rigid way? It's very tempting to say the government has to have done things differently, but they didn't. Now, the reality is things are as they are. Does it help me to harp on and be stuck? Or is it better for my functioning adaptation if I say, well, look, I wish that the government had saw this coming, had taken steps proactively to prepare for pandemics, but they didn't. So now we're in this mess. So let me acknowledge that, and let me say, I wish that they had done things differently, but what can I do now? So getting unstuck, in my view, means having a flexible, non-idealistic, realistic attitude. Things are bad, that's realistic, and they could have been done differently, that's realistic, but getting unstuck means saying, well, what can I change? Is this rigid attitude going to help me, or am I just going to hit my head against reality? And getting unstuck to me says adapting and flexible attitudes that are expressed with words like I wish or I want. I wish this pandemic had never happened, but it did. Now, what can I do to help adapt and cope and change what I can change? So getting unstuck means, in my view, having a flexible attitude, not a rigid attitude.
Doctor, so I was going through your Insta videos, and you said something like rigidity and flexible attitude, these are incompatible states of the mind.
Yes. Yes. I mean, if I say to you, so if I say a pandemic must not occur, well, that can't exist in the same mind that says, I wish this bad event weren't occurring, but sadly it is, and I acknowledge that reality is the way it is. You can't hold a rigid attitude and a flexible attitude simultaneously. It's like water and oil. So either you hold the attitude that reality must be the ideal scenario that I think it should and must be, or I hold the attitude that I wish it were different, but it doesn't have to be the way I wish it would be. Reality sometimes deviates from my ideal. Right. So yes, I stand by that position. They're incompatible.
So basically, it is about reducing the discrepancy between the ideal and the real?
Yes. And I would say adopting a realistic attitude and relinquishing the ideal. You use the ideal maybe for planning purposes, but recognize that an ideal version of life is fantasy. And what we're saying is realistic attitudes help us adapt to the present circumstances and change what we can change. So we're going to try to keep the ideal so we know how we want to change things. But I would say close that gap, but really relinquish the ideal on a day-to-day basis and come to terms with what is.
And this adapting and accepting can be very painful, like you said. So we currently have crematoriums filled with dead bodies, lined up, and this is not something that we have seen. And this is extremely painful for people who are detected, whose families are COVID positive, and they are not able to go to the crematorium. And so, grieving in isolation has made it extremely difficult. So how does one adapt and accept this process?
Well, that's a great question. How do you adapt? Not going to the crematorium, adapt to that is recognize that there are circumstances where you're going to every now and then face some very unlikely circumstances. This is like a once in a lifetime event. And so let me just understand. You're saying, how do you adapt to not going to the crematorium?
Yeah, because you're sort of COVID positive yourself. You've lost your mother or your father or your spouse, and so you're not able to go for the last rites.
I get it. Okay, yeah, you can't show up.
Some of the crematoriums have huge queue in numbers. The bodies are lining up there, and so accepting that is extremely painful because it's leading to a lot of anger and resentment.
Well, no, it's not leading to anger and resentment. That's the part you have to try to get rid of. You have to disabuse yourself of the idea that circumstances directly cause our feelings. Now, not being able to attend the last rites certainly is a negative state of affairs. And we could call that the adversity, but it doesn't directly cause your rage or your despair or your unhealthy grief. First of all, you have to recognize that whether you can go to the crematorium or not, you're going to have a negative emotion that's legitimate and healthy and appropriate, and that's sorrow. You lose someone, it's very, very sad, and that sorrow can be deep. But that sorrow comes with a philosophical stance, which is like, this is really, really sad and really bad, and this is the reality, And somehow it may seem impossible to get to, but I'm going to come to accept that all the conditions were such that this negative state of affairs occurred. And I'm going to see that I could sit here and say, I have to be at the crematorium, but I can't be there.
Right.
And that attitude that I have to be there is what is going to really create unhealthy disturbance. If I say to myself, look, I can have a grieving process that's respectful and honors my deceased person, I could do that in my bedroom, or I could do that at the crematorium. That could take place wherever you want it to take place. And so I think you have to give up this idea that I have to be at the crematorium and adopt, like, I can't be there. And now I'm going to honor my deceased relative by grieving here where I can. So it's adapting to reality by saying, I wish I could be there, but I can't be. So I'll accept that and be here. I don't have to be there. I'll be here, and that's how I'm going to proceed with my grieving.
And so there is another place where you said acceptance is a form of emotional acknowledgement.
Yes. Yeah. Acceptance, the way I define acceptance is that you acknowledge that a negative state of affairs exists. So you acknowledge that you wish, you recognize, you call to mind that you wish you could be at the crematorium. Actually, you wish that the pandemic had never occurred and life were operating as it normally would have. But so you acknowledge that reality is in a state of affairs exists that are highly undesirable. And you go beyond just that simple acknowledgement, and you go further and acknowledge that you wish an alternative state of affairs exist. But here's where acceptance is different than rejection. Not only is it an acknowledgement that you wish a negative state of affairs exist, but that you commit to giving up this idea that things have to be different than they are. And you then accept reality as it is by choosing to see that conditions were such that this was the way things were to unfold. And you then agree to move on or adapt or work with reality as it is. So you respond in a constructive way. In my view, acceptance involves acknowledgement and a choice to respond in a constructive way to the conditions that exist that you can't change.
Okay, so Dr. Walter, that's putting it down very, very simply, but a very, very hard process. I just want to ask you, with regards to the emotion of guilt, which people are facing because COVID is a transmittable disease. A lot of people are not aware about whether they are asymptomatic, and they may lose somebody in their family because of their neglect or their carelessness. So how does one deal with guilt?
Well, guilt is you have to understand the psychology of guilt. Guilt is essentially based upon a stance that you have in some way violated a moral code. And not only is it an acknowledgement that you've broken a moral code, but then there is an element of self-condemnation. And you say, well, I could have been more careful. I could have, practiced better hygiene. I could have had more discipline and wore my mask consistently. And I didn't. And I brought COVID home, and now I've given it to my mother. And I have, worst case scenario, now she's deceased.
Right.
Well, you certainly will acknowledge that you could have done things differently. You can't deny that part of it. The question becomes, do you have to condemn yourself? And what I show people is that you are human, and humans are slow learners, and humans don't always do, or often don't do, what is better. So we very often close the barn door after the horse has left the barn. So when you realize that you did something that may have contributed to the illness that a family member is now suffering with, you acknowledge your misbehavior, but that you recognize that to define yourself as a bad person and condemn yourself is false to the facts. Bad people don't exist. Bad deeds exist. Right. And maybe misbehavior exists. Careless behavior exists. But bad people, you're human, and humans engage. They have strengths and weaknesses, and it would be best for you to see yourself as a fallible human who could have done better, wishes they had done better, commit to doing better in the future, and recognize that your behavior, your misbehavior is a part of you, but it doesn't speak for the whole of you, and that you've done other probably good things for your mother. In this instance, maybe you've done a bad thing by not practicing the hygiene that you could have and maybe contributing to her getting it. At the end of the day, you have to recognize that human beings very often disappoint one another, and you're going to fall short of your standards. And you could either condemn yourself for the rest of your life, or you can accept yourself. Now, self-acceptance doesn't mean that you relinquish responsibility, right? So it's not a pass for misbehavior. But once you have done something that has injured another person or contributed to their negative predicament, you can't reverse time. What you can do is acknowledge that, accept yourself, and commit to changing your behavior. So you're still responsible for your behavior, even if you choose wisely to accept yourself. But you can acknowledge your misbehavior. Who hasn't misbehaved? I can't say that. Let he or she who's not guilty cast the first stone. And I'm not preaching religion. I'm just saying that a book like the Bible that's been around for years and years and years, the idea, it's wise to see that everybody falls short of their standards, and to condemn yourself doesn't help you change.
And that's spoken about the accepting yourself with your fallibilities, like you said. So how does one then reframe? A lot of people are consumed with disruptive thoughts, procrastination, a lot of ruminating negative thoughts that they get on a daily basis, anxiety. How does one start this journey of reframing their thoughts?
Well, by understand, how do you start? Well, let me see how I could put this in simple terms. You can go to my website, rebtdoctor.com, and listen to this in great detail. But let me give you a simple idea. So you begin by recognizing that how you think impacts how you feel. So you can't change how you feel until you acknowledge that your thinking plays a role. How you look at things, how you think affects how you feel. And that once you've made that recognition, that's the first step. The second step to reframing your attitude so that you cope with anxiety better is to recognize that you can think in a way that's extreme. So, for example, you could say to yourself that this pandemic or the threat to our health must not exist. That's a rigid idea. And then you can jump to an extreme idea like this is the end of the world and it's unbearable. Or you can have a more moderate position like, well, I wish the pandemic weren't happening. It's really a very dangerous state of affairs right now. But let's face it, it's not the end of the world. We haven't had nuclear war. We are involved in a war of sorts, and that's a very bad situation. But you acknowledge that bad things could be worse, that good can come from bad. And
Yep.
what good can come from this? Well, we can, for example, learn to maybe value our loved ones better,
Yep.
because sometimes we take them for granted. We could learn to recognize that hygiene is very, very important. And just because you can't, it might require an extra step to wash your hands or wear a mask or sneeze in your hand instead of just letting it out into the air, that you can bear that discomfort. And so I guess how you begin to reframe your attitudes is by thinking about your thinking. What makes humans unique is that we can think about our thinking. And just like a computer program needs to have code written that's nice and error-free, you can think about the code that's running in your head and edit it and make it more realistic. Like, you're fallible. You're not going to do everything that's right. Bad things are going to happen. Life is going to be hard. But in the end, there's a way that you can help yourself. So these are like basic ideas that I think you want to go over.
Yep.
And recognize that working with your emotions takes a certain amount of time.
Yep.
And that you're going to have to be patient, but you can do it. So that's how I would begin the process.
I want to put a question in here. Like you said, working on your emotions takes time. A lot of people walk in and say, I don't feel good. I should magically feel good. So like you said, on a daily basis, is there an exercise that we can give that would help people restore healthy states of emotion?
Yes. I think you could write down a couple of ideas, and every day when you're brushing your teeth, you could rehearse these ideas. So what would they be, for example, that would give us healthier emotions? So one idea might be, there are things I can control and there are things I can't. And I'm going to focus on what I can control. That's a simple idea.
Right.
And that's like one idea you could just say to yourself, in every situation I face today, I'm going to ask myself, what's under my control and what's not, what's beyond my control. And then I'm going to focus on doing what I can control. And the rest of it, I'm going to just let go. Okay? Another idea is to remind yourself that you're human and that you're going to try your best, but that you don't have to be superhuman, that you have limitations. So I would say you could remind yourself that you're going to try your best, but recognize that you don't have to execute perfectly well, and that you're going to accept yourself. So that's like a separate idea that you can write down and go over. I'm human. I'm a fallible human. Okay. Another thing you could say to yourself is, there's danger in the world, and I don't have to have certainty that I'm going to be safe. I want certainty, but I don't have to have certainty. And that's going to give you concern, because we don't know, any one of us could be dead tomorrow.
Right.
Death is always present, and it doesn't have to be a pandemic for that to happen.
Right.
So I would go over this. I know anxiety, a lot of times people say, I have to have certainty that I'm going to be safe or my loved ones are going to be safe. And it's like, I'm sorry, but we live in a world of probability. So you go over this idea when you're brushing your teeth. I don't have to have certainty that everybody's going to be safe. What I am going to do is control what I can control. I'm going to seek to control what I can control. And one thing that I can control is how I think about things. And one thing I can control is how I think about things that are beyond my control. The disease is beyond my control. I can't control if it mutates. But I can control if I wear my mask, if I keep my hands clean, if I stay home, if I try to have some degree of happiness. I know this sounds crazy, but maybe you can choose to try to have some degree of happiness, even in a very difficult circumstance.
Dr. Walter, I know, in the last session that I attended of yours, you tie down psychology to a lot of philosophy of life.
Mm-hmm.
And it is in some sense, about bringing meaning to your life. Can you give us more help on how, in a pandemic currently, can we attach basic meaning to life? Like you said, there are things we can control and there are things we can't control, and so sometimes people get so disappointed that they don't want to find any meaning that exists anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, if you're so disappointed that you don't want to find meaning, what you're really saying to me is that you're depressed.
Yep.
And if you're depressed, you first have to help yourself have a healthy emotional response. And people get depressed when they say life should not, absolutely must not be as hard as it is.
Right.
And they then say that life is totally meaningless. And what you need to do is attack that idea. Like, in my view, I think it was the Buddha who said life is suffering. Life is hard. I think life is hard. I mean, granted, some people have a life that's harder than other people, but I think it's hard for everybody in one way or another. There isn't one person that doesn't lose loved ones, lose love, lose money, get disappointed, get ill, and ultimately die. It happens to all of us. Now, granted, it happens to some people worse than others. I give you that. But I think you have to, in order to not lose meaning in life, recognize and accept that life is hard, and it becomes a little easier when you stop saying it shouldn't be as hard as it is.
Right.
Once you accept life as it is, now you can you have a space to work. Now, in terms of getting some meaning, what I think you want to do is, and I really believe this for getting through the pandemic, you really need to look for how to make lemonade out of lemons. So I have to tell you, this pandemic has been so good for me insofar as it's given me an opportunity to talk to people like you.
Yep.
That I normally might not have. So
yeah,
I think what you want to do to find meaning is ask yourself, in any given circumstance, is there any opportunity for me to somehow either do good or experience some degree of pleasure? Maybe you become good at writing poetry, or you start journaling, or maybe you start podcasting on how to help people, or maybe you volunteer
Yep.
to help your neighbors or your community. But to me, the way you find meaning is figuring out, doing something that is meaningful to you, that absorbs your interest. So for me, it's teaching people this philosophy.
Yep.
Right? And the way I'm getting through the pandemic is by trying to broadcast it to the widest possible audience. So maybe you're not a psychologist, but maybe you're a nurse. Well, maybe you could help your neighbors, or maybe you're a gardener. Maybe your skills might be relevant in some way. It might sound crazy, but maybe if you're a gardener, then you know how to help people bury the dead. Yeah. And although that's a grim task, it needs to be done for the community. You just can't have bodies laying around. Right. And so I think you have to get meaning, you got to accept reality and then figure out how to get engaged with life. So for me, my engagement is by teaching this philosophy. But your engagement might be knitting or making little, knitting little handkerchiefs that say in your native language, accept what you can't change. And then you start giving them out to people.
Right.
Everybody puts a drop in a penny in the bank, and then we have influence. No one is going to save the world single-handedly. I could tell you that.
Yeah. And you spoke about the Buddhist philosophy. And can you tell us more about how would you link that back to therapy? Because a lot of people still find it very difficult to come to therapy in India. We are still overcoming certain stigmas related to counseling. How do we tie it back to philosophy? Because it's a lot of acceptance and adaptation of life.
All right. Well, first of all, you need to see psychotherapy and counseling as nothing more than education.
Yep.
It's really education, psychological education. And people have shame because they go, well, they look at it like a medical model, like somehow I'm sick. And you should get the sickness stuff and throw it all out and move towards I'm human, and all humans profit from education.
Right.
And all I am is a teacher, and you're a teacher. And we're going to teach you some basic ideas for coping with life. So once a person says, well, all therapy is education, and I've been through school, what's wrong with taking continuing education as an adult? So to me, shame in psychotherapy is nonsense. You see it as adult education because that's what it is. That's why I can teach. You can go to my website and listen to these audios and get some benefit from them. If you listen to them over and over again, eventually it'll click. It's education. That's all this is. And philosophy, they used to call different philosophical schools because there were different ways to think about things. Right. So really, the shame is really saying I'm sick, and because I'm sick, I'm less worthwhile as a person. And that is a remnant of like Freud and the medical model. Right. And really what we want to think in terms of is educating people, starting with children, on how to begin to think about life so that they do well, even in difficult circumstances. It's strictly education. We're teaching ideas for coping.
Right. And Dr. Lastly, I want to ask you, you've put up a video on multiple levels of depression. And I think we are seeing a lot of that happening right now as we are coping through the pandemic. So what is this multiple level of depression?
Well, what it's not just with depression, but it can also be with anxiety. In other words, because we can think about our thinking, that what allows us to help ourselves is our ability to think about our thinking. And that's what happens when you do therapy is you think about your thinking and you think about your behavior, and then you try to change how you think, right? Well, when you have what happens is people will observe themselves feeling depressed. And then they begin to think about how they're behaving, and they get depressed about their depression. And they go, well, look at me. I'm walking around, moping around. I'm depressed because I say can't get married. The big wedding I was going to have, I can't have. I have to cancel it and wait a year for this to pass. Right? And then the person says, yeah, but I'm depressed. But look at my friend down the street. My friend down the street lost her mother and her aunt. And why am I so depressed? I shouldn't be depressed. So what happens is people begin to say, well, I'm depressed. And they notice they're depressed. And then they compare themselves to another person and go, well, I don't have it as hard as that other person. I shouldn't be depressed. So that's what I call the secondary layer, where you begin to have depression that is like a guilt-based depression about their initial depression, which is a deprivation of pleasure. So the wedding was going to be a pleasurable event. Right. And then they get, that's the primary depression. Then they begin to mope around and not do anything. And it's clear they're depressed. And then they stop and think about how they're handling things. They go, I shouldn't be handling it this way. It's not the end of the world. I'm such a bad person, such a weak person. Now they're depressed about their depression. And then they go, well, I could do something to help myself. Like, for example, I could still go for, let me ask you, I've never been to India, but is it okay from a health standpoint to put on a mask and go for a walk? Are there any places you could safely do something like that?
Not anymore, doctor. Right now, we're in a complete lockdown, and I think we're going to go in a further rigid lockdown right now.
Okay.
Extremely, extremely bad.
Okay, so now you have to change your mindset and say, okay, I'm like the astronauts on the space station. This is my environment, and I am going to stay in here, and I'm going to make the best of a bad situation, right? I'm still in my home. I have a radio. I have the internet. Okay. So I'm depressed. That's the primary depression. Then the secondary depression is I'm not handling it as well as my neighbor down the street who lost loved ones. I shouldn't be that way. And now I also have noticed that there are things I could do. Like, for example, this is a great time to read a book that is huge that you wish you had read long time ago. I mean, there are like these, really big books that we never get to read because, we're always going out, we're playing sports. Well, maybe now's the time for you to do things that you normally wouldn't do. And that third level of depression is, well, I don't have enough energy to do what I could do. So I'm really a weak person. Not only am I moping around not having my wedding, and not only am I now not handling my circumstances as well as my friend who lost her mother, but I'm not helping myself as I could. So you just go in a spiral and say, I'm a weak person, I'm a loser, I'm a failure, and it just goes on and on and on. And the way you break the cycle is by stopping it and saying, look, I'm a human. And humans get depressed. Humans mope around. And humans then depress themselves about their depression. So let me first accept myself and stop this craziness.
Right.
And then work on trying to accept the fact that, okay, maybe my friend down the street is handling her loss better than I'm handling mine. It doesn't make her a better person, but maybe I can model her attitude. So that'll help me maybe handle things a little better. Yeah. And then you go to the primary depression and address the thinking around that. Like, okay, I can't get married this year, but is it really the end of the world? Aren't I at least better off that I at least found somebody that I'm going to get married to, and now it's just a matter of waiting until the time is right? So I think you want to take each issue of depression and unpackage it using these thinking skills that I teach people.
And Doctor, lastly, I'm going to end it with, because we are seeing such high rates of the deaths occurring currently on a daily basis, I want to talk about survivor's guilt.
Well, first of all, to me, survivor's guilt is something that you could choose never to have, simply because it's not how long your life is, it's how well a life is lived. Wow. And if somebody dies if you're alive and somebody dies before you, essentially what you're saying is, one, my fate should be the same as theirs.
Right.
Well, that's false, because it isn't the same as theirs. Their fate is theirs, your fate is yours, and it's above your pay grade to determine who dies first.
Right.
It just happens that you were passed over for whatever reason, either because you were lucky and had a strong immune system, or you practiced better hygiene, or the gods just said, we don't want that person yet, we want this one. So right. In the end, survivor's guilt is about accepting life and accepting that life is unfair and that you don't have to feel guilty. You choose, you're making yourself feel guilty because you're saying, well, this person shouldn't be dead, but I should be. Well, that's just crazy thinking. It doesn't make sense. You're not accepting life. You don't determine when you die. You don't determine when other people die. And survivor's guilt is really saying, well, life should be a certain way and I should be dead too. No, it would be better if they weren't dead and you both were alive. But in the end, survivor's guilt is about accepting life as it is and giving up this idea that you too should have the same fate. It's like being guilty because you're born into one family rather than another. Well, you didn't pick the family. Let's assume you're born into a class of family that's a little better than another class of family, that you have certain privileges. Are you going to be guilty about the privileges you have? I don't think that's rational. I think I didn't pick that. I could have been born in India instead of being born in Philadelphia. Yep. It was beyond my choice. It wasn't like I said, I want to go to Philadelphia. I don't want to go to India. No. So there are things that are beyond our control, and we need to really accept that who dies and who lives often is random, and that life is unfair fundamentally, and that you don't have to feel guilty simply because you've had the privilege of living another day. You're saying, I should be dead? Question that idea.
Okay. And attached to this idea, often enough, we feel that I haven't done enough. I could have done more. And maybe I was inadequate.
Well, yes, you could have done more. And the reason I'm going to agree with you is because you're human, and humans are always going to have regrets. I always tell my patients, when you're on your deathbed, you're going to have regrets. What you want to try to do now is accept yourself and figure out how you can live the best life. But recognize that no matter how hard you try at living the best life you can, because you're a human, you're going to mess up. You're going to sometimes be a little lazy. You're going to sometimes use bad judgment. And yeah, you could have done more. And so my best advice to you is to accept yourself with your faults and then try to learn from them and do more in the future. But for now, that's the way it is. You could have done more. Accept yourself. I could have done more. You could have done more. And we're all a bunch of fallible humans running around. And you're going to have regrets. That's just life.
And doctor, while we fallible humans run around, how do we just motivate ourselves through the sailing pandemic? We know it's going to end. We've seen other countries open up. We're getting vaccinated as well. There is a lot of hope that we are seeing. How do we maintain motivation levels among all aspects of the population? So I'm talking about kids, I'm talking about adults. What can one do to bring levels of motivation up?
Focus on what you have, not what you don't have. Focus on what you can control, not what you can't control. I think if you look, life is what you make it. And you can come out of this strong and insightful, or you can come out of this depressed. And so I guess I'm telling you to try to make lemonade out of lemons. In other words, right. There is opportunity here. I know a lot of businesses have closed, and there have been a lot of people that have put in requests for new patents for ideas, because what happens when there are apps now for the phones that are going to have whether or not you're vaccinated, right? So one way to make lemonade from the lemons is to sit down and say, let me observe how life is going. Is there a business opportunity here? Is there a service that I could build that would that is, in other words, in any situation, there's opportunity. And if you stop feeling sorry for yourself and saying life shouldn't be so hard, you could go, well, what opportunities exist that I can exploit in the future from a commercial standpoint? Maybe it's making an app that will help people learn to help themselves through philosophy. Or maybe it'll be an app that shows that they're vaccinated. But for me, my business has taken off through this turn to the internet. And so I think that my view is look for opportunity and then exploit it. So maybe assume there's some opportunity in this negative state of affairs and focus on that. Focus on what you still have. If you're alive, where there's life, there's hope.
That's a great ending, and I see the hope coming. I think it's going to take some time, but we are going to get there. Doctor, thank you so much for your inputs. It's been an insightful conversation. We're going to put this up on our YouTube channel. We're going to share this on our social media platforms. I'm sure it's going to help a lot of people who are grieving and coping and adapting to the new phases of life. I think change is very difficult, and you've given us certain strategies of being flexible and having a free mindset.
Yes. Yeah, you can help yourself. And I would suggest that you, if I may interrupt you, go to my website, rebtdoctor.com, the full word doctor spelled out, and there's a lot of free information there that you could listen while you're in your home, and you could listen to it over again. You could talk about it with friends. There are worksheets that you could download. There's so much there, maybe too much. But and it's all free. There's not a dime. You don't have to spend one penny to access it. So maybe you could engage in this education that I'm talking about.
And I'm going to recommend the Instagram videos as well, because I think
the YouTube videos too. They're on YouTube, Instagram.
Okay, great. And we're going to tag your social media channels on this platform as well. Thank you so much for being here.
It was lovely meeting you. I've seen you.
Yep.
Thank you for this opportunity. Stay strong and keep on, learn more about REBT. It can really help you get through a tough time. It's rooted in ancient philosophy. It's been around